The U.S. added 28 Chinese entities to an export blacklist over concern about those companies' roles in human rights violations, just days before trade talks are supposed to resume in Washington. We're joined by today's panel, Yahoo Finance's Rick Newman and RSM chief economist Joe Brusuelas. Also joining us from Washington is South China Morning Post U.S. Bureau Chief Robert Delaney. And let me start with you, Robert. Why would the Chinese continue forward and go to this meeting on the 10th? If timing is everything, we just hit them with 28 companies on a blacklist. How are they going to retaliate?
Well, this has been a pattern with the negotiations that have been playing out for, we're coming up on a year and a half now where the Chinese delegations will come to Washington or the U.S. delegations will go to Beijing. And it's quite often these occur at moments when President Trump or the USTR either announces new tariffs or threatens new tariffs or makes provocative statements. And it's probably what you're seeing is the Chinese government is sort of used to these provocations that come out from the Trump administration. So, but it should also be known that the 2 days of talks that were scheduled this week in Washington look like what we're hearing is that they've been cut down to 1 day. So that's probably a response to the blacklist and to other matters that are causing friction between the U.S. and China.
Will the Chinese just at one point just cut it off and say, we're not coming, you think, given what's happened over the last 48 hours?
Well, like you said earlier in this program, never say never. I mean, we've seen the Chinese side pull away from or sort of cut short visits earlier this year. They haven't flat out said, no, we're not coming. But you also have to consider that we did have a period of several months earlier this year where there were no talks scheduled and there was no indication that the talks would resume. So you could consider that itself a period in which the Chinese did not want to come to the table. So yes, that's a possibility.
Robert, it's Rick Newman. What do you think of the idea that China may just decide to wait this all out? They see that President Trump is struggling here at home. He's got to deal with impeachment now, and they may just want to wait until the 2020 election is over. What do you think about that?
Well, I think there's a lot of consideration for that as an option, but I think the Chinese also see very clearly how much anger there is in Congress these days, not only among the Republicans, but among the Democrats about China. And that anger is directed at China on many fronts. It's not just the trade imbalance. It's not just forced transfers of intellectual property. It's also the issue of how China is treating its ethnic minorities, specifically the Uyghurs. So many lawmakers in both parties, ranking lawmakers, are making a lot of noise about this. So I think the Chinese are aware that if Trump is no longer president, if the White House goes to the Democrats after the next election, this might not necessarily be better for them.
Right. Robert, as someone who works for a news outlet that's based in China, what do you think we miss here in the U.S., either in Washington or amongst the media, about China's position on the trade war?
Well, it's important, first of all, to point out that the South China Morning Post is actually based in Hong Kong, which is part of China, but it is an autonomous city in China. So we do have editorial independence from the mainland Chinese media. But that said, it should be pointed out that there are differences of perspectives here when we look at the way that the U.S. government deals with China when it makes accusations against China. You have to understand that from the Chinese perspective, they're looking at this from the perspective of aggression against China by Western powers for 150 years. I mean, we're talking going back to the Opium Wars. We're talking about unequal treaties that were forced upon China after World War I, World War II. So the Chinese government and many of the Chinese see these what they consider to be very aggressive stances against China to be a continuation of this history, whereas when you're looking at it from an American perspective, very few people on this side really are aware of that history.
Right.
So when there's such a reaction, it's hard to understand why that reaction is so forceful in China.
Gotcha. Robert, Delaney, thank you. A really interesting perspective there. South China Morning Post U.S. Bureau Chief joining us from Washington.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.